waterborne transportation of merchandise be done on a vessel that is built in the U.S., 75% U.S. owned, and U.S. crewed, U.S. flag, which means U.S. crewed. That isn't a, sorry, my screen, it keeps blinking here. There we go. The U.S. crew requirement isn't part of the Jones Act itself. It's a requirement for all U.S. flag, whether you're a Jones Act vessel or just a general U.S. flag vessel operating internationally. So there are similar laws to the Jones Act that apply to other areas. Passengers is the Passenger Vessel Services Act. There are also regulations on towing and dredging that also restrict these operations to U.S. vessels. And these are collectively known as the coastwise laws. A lot of people refer to the Jones Act as encompassing all of this, but the Jones Act is really just the merchandise aspect of it. So the critical question in determining whether the Jones Act applies is whether there's transportation between one U.S. point to another U.S. point. If either point is not a U.S. coastwise point, the Jones Act isn't involved and it's not a problem. So what's a point? All points in the territorial sea are points, whether onshore or on the water, which is generally about 3 nautical miles offshore. There are some areas, especially in the Gulf, where it goes a little further, possibly to 9 or 12, but for the most part, it's about 3 nautical miles offshore. The Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, OXLA, extended application of the coastwise laws to OCS structures. And OCS structures is defined as those that are in place for exploration, development, or production of seabed minerals. Now, the Customs and Border Protection, CBP, interprets and enforces the coastwise laws. So they decide whether or not OXLA would extend the Jones Act to wind farm structures. It's not really clear right now because wind isn't a seabed mineral, it's above the water. So we're not sure. The Coast Guard has taken the position that OXLA does not apply to wind farms, but CBP hasn't given an answer. There's about 3 customs rulings on wind farms, but in all 3 of them, the requester had simply assumed that the Jones Act would apply, and so it hasn't really been addressed. So far, we counsel everyone to assume that it does apply and to fully comply with the Jones Act and all of the other coastwise laws during construction, operation, and maintenance of offshore wind farms. So I'm just going to chat briefly about Jones Act vessel ownership. There are 2 types of ownership under the U.S. flag. One is known as the documentation citizen, and this is just simply to register a vessel with the Coast Guard. And for that, the business or person must be incorporated in the U.S. or be a U.S. citizen if it's an individual. The CEO, president, and chairman have to be U.S. citizens, and no more than a minority of a quorum of the board of directors must be U.S. citizens. Now that's just to register. If you want to participate in the coastwise trade, there's a few other requirements. First, you have to meet all the requirements on the last slide. And next, at least 75% of the stock or interest in the corporation must be owned and controlled by U.S. citizens. And these requirements must be met at all levels in the chain of ownership. And this is the most difficult aspect for Jones Act vessel ownership. And what that means is you can't just set up a U.S. company and install a U.S. CEO and other U.S. officers to run it and have it owned by some other large offshore wind developer or some other large corporation level all the way until you get to individual people. Must be majority U.S. owned. So we get this question a lot. Can I get a waiver? The biggest one is there's no vessel that exists that can do this. Can we just get a waiver? And the short answer is no, it's really not possible. Waivers are very, very rare. If they're requested by DoD for a specific military cargo, they're granted. Usually this is some important piece of military machinery that needs to move and they can't find anyone else to move it quick enough or that's capable of moving it, and they get a waiver. The only times really that it's been for commercial reasons has been after hurricanes, national disasters, drawdowns of the National Reserve, which was a while back now. And those are really the only times that a general waiver has been granted. They're not available just because you can't find a vessel that can do it. That said, the Jones Act hasn't impeded offshore wind farm development thus far, and a combination of Jones Act and foreign flag vessels was used to construct deep water wind fairly successfully. So let me see. I'm sure you've all heard a lot about this lately. CBP last year changed its interpretation on two fairly critical aspects for offshore development, both oil and gas and wind farms. And that is equipment of the vessel and lifting operations. It was kind of a controversial move, and it was effective on February 17th. There were at least 30 some comments received. It was all done via paper comments, which is rare for CBP. And CBP issued its final decision on December 11th. And as I said, it was effective back in February. The first aspect that this decision addressed was equipment of the vessel. And by way of background, equipment of a vessel.
Sorry about this, is Pat. I think the slides, did you have a slide for this? Because the slide is still on the waiver, still the waiver slide.
It is? It's not, okay. Let me try going back and forth here. Is it moving?
No.
I see the next one for me.
Maybe unshare and then reshare and see if that does the trick. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. Oh no. I've lost it here.
I can also share if that's helpful.
Now my screen is just blinking.
Lane, do you have the slides? Maybe Lane will pull those up and go to the slide after that. We'll go to the slide after the waiver slide, Dana. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Are you able to see it?
Yep,
yeah, I can see it. That should be it. That's it.
Okay. Right. Thank you, Lane.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Okay.
And this one I just covered, like I said, it was a recent proposal in October, final decision in December, and it was effective in February. So if we could go to the next one. Move this down. Okay. So the first issue that this decision addressed was equipment of the vessel. And for background, equipment of the vessel isn't merchandise. And because of that, it can be laden and unladed at two different coastwise points by non-Jones Act vessels. So initially, this was items that are necessary and appropriate for the navigation, operation, or maintenance of the vessel and for the comfort and safety of people on board. This was usually stores, line, spare parts, crew necessaries, and things like that that a vessel would normally carry. However, as the offshore oil and gas industry developed and rulings kept being issued on equipment by CBP, and they kind of got away from this principle, and they started using qualifiers like mission of the vessel, foreseeability, incidental, and it really got away from this idea that this equipment was things that the vessel would normally carry. So for example, there are a number of rulings out there addressed by this decision that looked at this vessel is going to install this piece of equipment, therefore the mission is to install it, not transport it, and therefore the transportation is really just incidental, and so that vessel could also transport it. And a lot of people believe that this was inappropriate and really took this equipment of vessel definition and made it way too broad. Next slide, please. So CBP initially took action to rein in this equipment of the vessel idea in 2009. A ruling was issued on a Christmas tree, which is a fairly significant piece of equipment that goes on top of a wellhead. And they had initially ruled that a foreign flag vessel could transport it and install it as equipment. And shortly thereafter, they took it back. And then in 2009, they proposed to also take back another number of other rulings on this equipment of the vessel concept and really try to rein this definition in. It didn't work out. They eventually withdrew the proposal. And then they tried again in 2017. They tried to revoke about 25 equipment of the vessel rulings, and they again faced substantial public opposition, and they withdrew the rulings. I wasn't terribly involved in these, any of it, and having to say, but from what I understand is that the revocations were fairly unclear and nobody could really figure out what the rule was going to be. Next slide. So CBP's recent decision modifies or revokes many of these same rulings that they tried to address in 2009 and in 2017. It eliminates the mission of the vessel and all of those other justifications for determining equipment of the vessel. And it brings it back to that initial definition: necessary and appropriate for navigation, operation, or maintenance, and comfort and safety. So this brings it back to things the vessel would normally carry, things that are integral to the everyday function of the vessel. And one of the not determining but critical factors is whether after the work is done, it's going to return to the vessel and depart with the vessel and not be left on the seabed. So the one thing that CBP did do is they clarified that this doesn't change their paid out, not unladen analysis, which is what they apply to pipeline, cable laying, subsea fiber optics, and all of those things. And for those items, CBP views it as that they're not being unladen at a point. They're being usually off of a reel and just laid as the vessel moves. So they don't view those as a coastwise operation at all. Next slide. The next area that the decision addresses is lifting operations. So for many, many years, CBP has interpreted the Jones Act as allowing a foreign flag crane vessel to load and unload cargo or construct or dismantle marine structure, as long as the movement was incidental to the lifting operation. Now, this incidental to the lifting operation wasn't very well defined. People really didn't know what movement incidental meant, and there were some liberties taken over the years, primarily due to safety reasons. For example, moving a little bit away from the structure to do the actual lifting, and then moving 500 feet or so back to where the lift was going to be placed for safety, to make sure they didn't hit the existing structure or the vessel or drop it on the wellhead, things like that. But in 2012 and 2013, an attorney with the last name Koff requested a series of rulings, and he tried to clarify and really pinpoint what this incidental movement meant and what that meant that the lifting vessel could do. And in response, CBP said that any movement off of the vessel's central axis while lifting, even a short distance for lift safety, would be a violation. So what this meant was these crane vessels could stay on DP and they could rotate, but they couldn't move in any direction at all during the lift, or it would be a violation. And as you can imagine, this caused a lot of problems for the offshore industry because a lot of these lifts just couldn't be done safely without some minimal movement. Next slide. So in this decision, CBP revokes these Koff rulings, as they're called. It finds them overly restrictive and not an accurate reflection of the Jones Act. This new interpretation includes lifting by cranes, winches, lifting beams, and similar activities or operations from the time that the lift begins until the time that it can be safely completed. It'll include the vertical movement of the item, which has always been part of that, as well as any lateral movement that's necessary to safely move it. So in other words, this idea of incidental movement, as the industry had initially assumed, where you could move a little bit around the lift area to make sure it's done safely, it can now be done that way without violating the Jones Act. And this definition isn't limited by the size of the lift, so it applies to small lifts, large lifts, basically anything. And it also includes being able to set whatever you're lifting down on the deck of the lifting vessel temporarily to make sure that the lift is done safely. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, a lot of comments were received on various aspects of this proposal when CBP initially put it out there in October. A lot of people questioned about how this would impact offshore wind construction, how it would apply. And unfortunately, CBP responded with a non-response, really. They said that it would be determined based on specific rulings and circumstances. So right now, we still don't know if offshore wind farms will be considered coastwise points by CBP. As I mentioned, the Coast Guard doesn't consider them to be as part of OXLA. So there's a big question mark there. So next we're going to go to compliance strategies. Next slide. As I mentioned, thus far, we counsel every one of our clients to assume that an offshore wind farm is going to be looked at just like the oil and gas rigs that are out there now. And we counsel everyone to comply fully with the Jones Act, and we assist them in how to do that. And these are two of the methods by which we've seen companies find a way to do this in compliance. And the first is using Jones Act feeder vessels. And all the components are staged and pre-assembled at a U.S. port. And a Jones Act feeder vessel, generally barges, will transport the components out to the installation locations. And the foreign flag installation vessel will install the components. Now, prior to February, these installation vessels had to stay on their central axis and rotate only. But after February 17th, they can make some movement to make the installation safely. Now, something that's unique to wind farms is, as you know, often they'll have components for multiple turbine locations on one vessel. And you want to make sure that this lifting operation is just for the current lift. So for example, you couldn't have a feeder barge come out and have the lifting vessel take on multiple monopiles or something and then move around the wind farm location installing them all. That wouldn't be included in the lifting. It would have to be one at a time. The second model that we've seen is the ready in time. And under this model, components are transported directly from overseas straight to the OCS. They don't unload them at a US port at all. And then the foreign flag installation vessel meets them offshore and they install them there. And because there isn't transportation between two coastwise points at all, the Jones Act doesn't apply and they can take whatever movement they need to install. And the last aspect is cable laying. As I mentioned before, because cable laying is paid out, it's not unladen, it's not viewed as coastwise trade. The one caveat that we like to mention is that, as I mentioned way at the beginning, dredging is also restricted. So if there's any dredging needed, which there typically is, to install the cable, that has to be looked at really critically, especially if there's big boulders or something in the way that need to be moved. That could be a problem. Or the cable laying mechanism. A lot of the time they use these towed that use jets to turn up the soil, and the cable just naturally falls through. And CBP has ruled that that is not dredging, but any type of plowing or anything like that would be viewed as dredging, and that could be a problem. Next slide, please. So we've covered the Jones Act pretty well. I'm going to move on to crewing issues and talk about this briefly, because we have seen a lot of complications, especially for offshore wind farms. So foreign crew members bound for foreign vessels engaged in wind farm work have had challenges getting visas. Now, as I mentioned, the Coast Guard doesn't view wind farm work to be OCS activity under OXLA. And because of this, they won't issue these manning exemption letters that they usually issue for vessels that are working in oil and gas. And without that letter, embassies weren't issuing the B visas that these crew members needed to come over. Last year, the Foreign Affairs Manual was changed so that these letters were no longer required. And there's a new visa annotation for wind farm workers. And they should put this annotation here on the slide, B1 for transit or travel to the OCS for wind activities, not OCS activities. Now, unfortunately, this is a pretty new change. It was just last year, I want to say in the fall. And a lot of embassies are still not very familiar. There's not a whole lot of wind farm work here, so they don't see it terribly often, though it is getting more common. So it's often critical to explain to the embassy where this Foreign Affairs Manual section is and why this crew member should be given this new visa annotation. And we found that a support letter from the company or an attorney explaining this has been really critical to getting a successful visa. Obviously, right now with COVID, there's additional problems getting crew in and crew out. The current presidential proclamations restrict US entry for anyone from a number of countries, China, much of Europe. I think Brazil is in there now. There's one exception for sea crew, which is critical, and it means that anyone that's seeking a C1D visa, a C1, a D, and even a B visa should be able to get that visa still if you request an expedited appointment. Unfortunately, the embassies are pretty swamped right now, and they just haven't had the manpower to even be able to grant appointments for sea crew. So we've really had a struggle getting crew members in, and sadly getting crew members that are here off and home to their families. The recent one I guess I should point out here is that the L, H, and J visas are now suspended until the end of the year. So you can't get those visas right now. There's no exception for sea crew. If you have employees that already have them, that's fine, they can still come in, but there's no new ones that are going to be granted. Next slide. For US flag vessels, we're also seeing a lot of problems. As I mentioned before, US flag vessels require a US crew, which generally isn't a problem, but all seamen also have to have merchant mariner credentials. This used to be known as an MMD or a Z card when I sailed, but now it's all wrapped up into one neat document. It all comes in one little book. And the Coast Guard interprets who is going to be a seaman. And they interpret it very, very broadly. And they include all the technical industrial personnel, welders, technicians, turbine techs, and all of that sort of thing that really aren't involved in the navigation of the vessel. They're often known as the back deck crew. And traditionally, they wouldn't have these MMCs. They would just have DCW or a few other credentials, but not the MMC. And a critical requirement to get an MMC is you have to be a US citizen. And because of that, all of these industrial personnel that are needed to construct and maintain offshore wind farms need to be US citizens. Some foreign citizen consultants are permitted, but it's a very narrow definition. It's usually like a vendor rep, if you need to have your radar rep come in, something like that. But all of these other personnel need to be US citizens. Now, to prepare for this, there's a few movements ongoing to try to get some US citizens trained to do a lot of these jobs. The Offshore Wind Jobs and Opportunities Act is pending. That'll be $25 million in grants to colleges, trade schools, and other organizations that can provide some of this training. There are numerous state and joint industry grants. There's one in New York that's going to be a pretty large training center in combination with, I think it's Orsted, but don't quote me on that. Mass Maritime is also going to be the first US institution to offer the GWO courses, which will be helpful. And then we have, perhaps some cross training. We have a lot of wind farms shore-based in the US that perhaps we could look to training people to go offshore. Next slide. And that's all I have. There are a few other issues that apply to wind farms that I haven't covered in detail. OSHA, for example, doesn't apply offshore, but it would apply to any onshore operations, the staging, pre-assembly, crane work, things like that. And then when you get to construction, you also have issues with the Endangered Species Act that really applies to use of bubble curtains and when you can operate. And that's all I got. I'm ready for questions.
Dana, thank you. So for everybody, if you could use the hand raise function to ask a question, if you're on the phone, which we do have 4 people, you can actually hit *9, and that actually raises your hand on the phone. And *6 mutes you on the phone, but you can use your own phone mute, but *9 is the way to raise your hand. Folks on the phone, the participant list, you just go to that, and that has the hand raise function. And Lane and I will just kind of track that. If you do have a question and want to just put it in chat, we can also try to track it that way too. So want to be open to any questions people want to raise, for Dana, who's super expert on this stuff and can really help answer a lot of the complex nuances here. So questions from task force members or others participating.
going to jump in and ask a question. This is Ben Lyons, and I have no idea how to raise my hand.
Let's go for it. Just state your name and then go for it.
I gave like a thumbs up. I have a quick question. Thank you, Dana. That was awesome. I have a question regarding the points that you discussed, the CBP's determination of points. What is their definition as of now of, and why wouldn't that be something that was already determined?
Well, the problem comes with, because these offshore wind farm locations are outside of the territorial sea, they're on the OCS, the definition is really related to OXLA and how OXLA defines where the coastwise laws are extended to. So they clearly apply to oil and gas structures because they are built in place to take minerals from the seabed. Because wind is above the water, it's not clear that OXLA extends the Jones Act to those structures. As I mentioned, we tell everyone to assume they do. We assume that CBP is going to come down that way and that they are going to say that they are all points under, sorry, my screen is wigging out here, that they're going to all say that they are points for the purposes of the Jones Act. And what that means is that each individual turbine, as well as the wind farm as a whole, would be a point. So you have one big point, and then you have a lot of points within a point. Does that answer your question?
And any follow-up to that?
No, it doesn't. Thank you very much.
You bet. Megan, you're next. Think you have a few questions.
Yes, thanks, Pat. So I just have two questions. The first one is, I saw earlier on the kind of foreign feeder boats, you know, or U.S. boats to a foreign boat thing, and it said that wind turbines would be assembled on land in U.S. ports and then transported to the foreign installation vessel. But I'm wondering if anybody can expound on the, I think that for the Dominion Wind project, the turbines were assembled in Nova Scotia and then brought out to the project site. Is that correct? And also, with the slide about credentials, merchant marine credentials on U.S. flag boats for like installation processes, on the foreign vessels, are there similar requirements to that, merchant marine credentials? Thanks.
On the credential question, for the foreign vessels, the credentials would be whatever the flag of that vessel requires. So the U.S. doesn't have any specific requirements. That would be entirely up to the flag. Of course, there are international conventions that would require certain credentials. STCW is the main one. And then there's also the labor convention, which would be more living conditions. But those would be governed by international conventions and not the U.S. in particular for the foreign flag vessels. On how Dominion did their construction, I'm not really sure. I wasn't involved in that, so I can't answer that question.
But just to be clear, even though Canada is our next door neighbor, the Jones Act applies equally to them as it does to Nigeria or Ghana or anybody else. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, say that again?
I'm assuming that despite Canada's next door, the Jones Act applies to them as a foreign vessel just like any other country around the world.
A Canadian vessel, yes. Yeah.
Good, Megan, did that answer your questions?
Yes, thank you.
Other questions from folks? And again, raise your hand function, go on chat, or just jump in if you have to. Jeff, you're next. Jeff Kim.
Yes, hi, thank you. I just wanted to ask about this issue about an offshore structure being a point, what the presenter thinks about that issue. I don't know, I was in the Coast Guard way back in the 70s and have been in the fishing industry since that time. And the Jones Act has always been sacred to us here. And in fact, you know, it was 1977 when all the foreign hulls were kicked out of the U.S. exclusive economic zone. And now we see the potential for foreign boats to come in and we will do what we believe would be significant environmental damage without having to abide by Jones Act requirements like we have to. So anyway, I guess I'd like to ask the presenter to comment on whether or not an offshore structure should become a point to be defined to require Jones Act compliance. Thank you.
We think that it will. As I said, we tell all of our clients to comply with the Jones Act as if all of the offshore wind farm locations are coastwise points under the Jones Act. I hear you. I'm a Jones Act mariner myself. I came from this industry, and we're doing our best to make sure that all of our clients comply fully with all of the laws and regulations that apply. So far, CBP just has refused to take a stance on this, and I really think that it's going to require someone coming in and requesting a ruling specifically on this point to force them to take a position on it. Like I said, thus far, everyone is complying with it. Now, how that's interpreted in terms of, for example, when you bring a ship directly from foreign to here and unload it directly on the OCS, the Jones Act doesn't apply. And I know there's a movement here to require that any activity on the Jones Act, any construction on the OCS be done by Jones Act vessels. And I get that and I respect that, but that would require a legislative change to the Jones Act or to OXLA to make that happen. Unfortunately, the Jones Act just wouldn't apply that way right now.
All right, well, thanks for the answer. I appreciate that.
And Dana, to be clear on that last point, the issue is that the Jones Act says point to point. So
Right.
if you're coming from Denmark to a structure in the OCS, it's really 1 point, not 2, and that's why the Jones Act wouldn't apply.
Exactly. It has to be between 2 US points. The Jones Act doesn't require, and now I know for fishing, the fisheries law is different. You know, if you want to fish in the US, you have to comply with all of these requirements. And the Jones Act just doesn't work like that. It doesn't apply like that. There isn't a law that says that all activities on the OCS have to be done by a US vessel right now.
Well, I didn't fully understand that. I'll look forward to Congress eventually passing something like that before the end of my life in the area here. So thanks.
Sure.
Jeff, maybe you have a long life to be able to meet that condition.
I'm going to need it.
Other questions, comments, things you'd like Dana to answer, and then we're going to just show a few videos from the offshore wind developer perspective and kind of what are kind of some of these vessels that are going to be out there. So, other questions for Dana and her really drawing on her great expertise here that people have. So I don't see any right now. So what I'd like to do is, okay, Dana, if you are obviously hopefully willing to stay on here and be helpful to us. What I might do, Lane, what do you think? Maybe we should just play a few of these videos and give people a sense of some of these vessels. And then if there are questions for the industry about them or questions to Dana about the vessels, have at it. So maybe we'll show a few of these videos. And as Lane pulls those up, the videos are a bit long. We're trying to give you mostly the visual and the sense of the ship and a little bit of their operation. So there's some narration and some music that we're less interested in, but we may skip through a few of these, but we want to give people a little bit of a flavor. So Lane, I'll turn the directorship over to you.
Sure. John O'Keefe, do you have anything you want to say before I start, or?
No, so we're trying to show some representations of offshore wind vessels. So there's, obviously there's a wide range of vessels, anything from installation vessels, which we know currently we don't have in the U.S. right now as a U.S. flag vessel, but hopefully that's going to change in the near future. We'll have at least one, but the other vessels represented are SOVs, or service operation vessels. Those are coastwise trade vessels. Operating out of U.S. ports, so those will be new builds, U.S. flag vessels, and then crew transfer vessels, which are also coastwise trade and will be U.S. flagged. We currently only have one CTV in the U.S., but there is one I can happily say there's another one about to launch in the next, I don't know, month or so, and then there's 3 more in the pipeline as of today.
And John, we do those acronyms one more time. So the
CTVs are crew transfer vessels. So those are how you deliver the technicians shorter distances out to the turbines to conduct routine maintenance. And then the SOVs are like, typically you'll have crews stay out for 2 weeks at a time out in and around the wind farm, closer access, less commute is one way to say it. Less commute out to the wind farm.
Great. And Tom, you had a question?
Hotel vessels.
Yeah.
Hotel vessels. There we go. Thank you. Tom, you had a question?
Yeah, so I did have a question. So could we point out which ones of these are Jones Act vessels and which ones are not as we're going through the video? Thanks.
So all the vessels except for the installation vessels right now, because again, we don't have a U.S. flagged installation vessel to utilize, but all others, because they're coastwise trade, will be U.S. flagged.
And as if you see a vessel and you're not sure, you ask and we'll jump in. So.
First high-speed ferry to Martha's Vineyard, and to be the first crew transfer vessel in the United States was just, it's great to have that type of achievement behind you.
So this vessel is obviously U.S. flagged.
Driver for the state and where it's going to be going in the future. So I ended up getting the contract to build the Atlantic Pioneer, which was constructed at Blount Boats here in Warren, Rhode Island, and ultimately was the first crew transfer vessel.
That one was built in Rhode Island.
Local built wind farm, and it's definitely exciting to be part of that.
So I kind of carved out a second career working with this boat. I watched them build the wind farms. I thought it would be real interesting at my age to get involved in this and be part of it. I mean, it's the first in North America. I think that's pretty significant. Pretty proud of that.
So these typically carry one master, one mate, and potentially another deckhand. And then there's going to be, a pool of captains and mates that operate these vessels.
3 or 4 other captains that run this boat. The younger guys are more excited about the future and the expansion of towers and new boats coming on.
It's nice to see that this is just the ground floor. There's a lot of other opportunities that are going to come up, not just here off the
Just an FYI, this is Charlie Donadio, who owns Atlantic Wind Transfers. He just won a contract for 2 more crew transfer vessels.
Expanding our facility here, we have about 6 acres of property, and we're changing it up and improving the property so that we can bring in a dozen CTVs, as many as we can, to start building up a full day commercial industry. We're just looking forward to the next stage, the next bigger wind farms we can be part of as well.
All right, good. That was a Rhode Island accent. Speed it up for all of those of you who were wondering.
I
I was going to say, he doesn't usually sound like that, but he does. Yeah.
Just trying to go back. Sorry, Mike. Yeah. You want to do this one?
Wait a minute, they kind of.
This one? Sorry, if the audio is bad, I'm having some issues. My computer's not new enough to do advanced audio.
So I work on the vessel for Race Bank Wind Farm, and we go out every 2 weeks. So we're 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off.
So this is a service operation vessel. So these are like floating hotels.
Been in the offshore wind industry for 5-6 years now.
So obviously not a small vessel. You've got crew quarters, gyms, movie theaters. And then of course you've got all your parts, your small parts. You see here a crew transfer vessel and a service operation vessel. This is one of the newer ones from Orsted. So there's 20 crew on this, 20 professional crew, 40 techs. That what you just saw there was a heave compensated gangway.
It's easy to move yourself.
Go on.
So this is obviously set up to try to make 2 weeks at sea more comfortable than most of us here that are mariners are used to or have been used to.
And John, these would be compliant as well. So these would be U.S. vessels.
Well, just to be clear, I know we say compliant a lot, but we're always Jones Act compliant, but these will be U.S. flag vessels. The SOVs will be, because they're going to operate in and out of U.S. ports. So how many of these there are, when it really depends on the developers, but it depends on the logistical plans and strategies. But we do know that these are coming. The service operation vessels are coming to the U.S. and will be built in U.S. flagged, so they'll be built here.
Okay, I think that gives us a good sense of that. John, anything else on this video? Maybe I think we probably getting a sense of that vessel. Anything else we need to see on that?
No, I think it gives you, like you say, it gives you a good sense of the scope of this vessel, and how it gets people to work. And then Fred Olson, this is an installation vessel. I think, as most of you know, there is not currently a U.S. flagged installation vessel, but Dominion has recently announced the potential for a U.S. flagged installation vessel. Obviously, these are very large vessels. From that photo there, you can see these are not small. These are large vessels, so they require 2 to 3 years lead time to be built in a shipyard, and they also a very significant outlay of funds. So you're looking anywhere in the ballpark, $300 to $500 million for one vessel. And then even, one vessel doesn't solve all of the offshore wind farm developers' problems, because obviously one vessel can be working on one project at a time. So, there's great hope for U.S. flagged installation vessels, but we just don't currently have them. And you can see there's a helipad on here. There's a sizable amount of crew and professional marine crew, and then obviously all the techs that go in and help construct and commission the turbines. So these can hold 60 to 160 people.
And this is probably naive on my part, this is Pat. So for Dana, for this vessel, it can install things and it has some room to move given the change to the ruling, but it actually can't transport the equipment from a US port to the wind energy area. The transport of the turbines, the blades, the pylons, whatever, has to come on a US vessel, and this thing installs that off of another boat or from another boat. Is that correct?
Right. Yes.
And you can see here, this vessel is actually jacked up, and it's an extremely technical vessel. The cranes are incredibly heavy lift capable, high tech. When you go from the towers that are less, they're more straightforward as you put in the bottom pieces of the towers, but as you go up and then you get into the blade install, they become increasingly technical.
Great. All right. Good. So any questions for John or for the industry folks about these three kinds of vessels, how they're flagged, compliance or otherwise? So any questions about the vessels themselves right now? Jeff, question.
Yeah, thank you. Incredible technology. It's really helpful to be able to see it that way. It was a nice presentation. So the thing that I really have always respected about the Jones Act is that it would require anybody that wants to come over here and do business, essentially, at least from port to port, employ Americans to build the boats. And so to me, it's a jobs issue. So I wondered, what the estimate of the number of jobs that a 2 or 3 year project building a $500 million construction vessel would represent. And I guess I'm also kind of curious to understand how much a developer will save on an annual basis by bringing these foreign hulls over rather than build them here. And so I guess I'm speculating about, it's not really a question, but relative to the decision by Dominion when to build a boat, I'm encouraged that maybe the economics long-term, these are 20-year leases, would include the industry committing to building even the construction boats in the United States and produce United States jobs. So was it, it's, I guess we'll never know. It's probably, private information, but I'm encouraged to see that Dominion obviously thought the economics were right in building that boat. So if somebody has a comment about why they can do it and the other developers haven't committed to that approach, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, so maybe one of the developers talk about both the number of jobs per, I don't know, whatever size the project you want to name, and the question Jeff raised about kind of economics of foreign versus U.S. vessels for the installation.
And maybe, John, you could also just clarify that it's not, my understanding is it's not Dominion who will be actually owning that vessel, but
Right.
it's part of a larger consortium.
It's a consortium. Yeah, great point, Kristen. So just in general, Jeff, you've been around boats a long time. You know it's better to use your friends' boats than buy your own. So developers in general, we're not boat owners, but we utilize many contractors, and those contractors are boat owners and operators, or vessel owner operators. So what it really comes down to, Jeff, is project certainty. And I know that's probably not what anyone wants to talk about, but you can't have a $300 to $500 million commitment. And right now it's unclear how that consortium with Dominion will move forward because of the lack of project certainty. So the supply chain, including new vessel builds, is greatly affected with no project certainty. Not many banks, no banks will fund a venture like that without fully understanding the pipeline. So, it's quite complicated. But people like, for smaller vessels, people like Charlie Donadio, who took a leap. Obviously, it's a much different dollar investment. You're looking at $5-6 million per crew transfer vessel, much smaller, but still a leap of faith without having project certainty for owner operators like himself. They need to be able to book that vessel out at a day rate that recoups their investment and keeps the vessel quite busy. That may or may not be just offshore wind. In terms of jobs, someone can jump in to help me out, but I mean, in a typical shipyard, for a build that size, you're looking at several hundred shipyard jobs. But that will be people that are already employed, but it's work for the shipyard, significant capital outlay.
And for the task force, it may be, if you want to kind of dive into some of the job creation at all these different scales and levels, that may be something we want to do.
I appreciate the answer. I think that's good enough. I appreciate the answer. Thank you.
You're good, Jeff. Great. Thanks. Peter, you're next. And Peter, just unmute. There you go.
Am I unmuted? I guess. Yeah. I recently watched some kind of promotional film that went into how these wind towers are getting taller and taller, and the blades are getting longer and longer. So when you look at one of these installation vessels and realize it's a $300-500 million investment, do you have any idea as to the life of a vessel like that, in terms of either doing anchored wind farms as opposed to those anchored in the sea bottom? I mean, are those vessels very flexible? And then are they being built, or the ones that exist, are they being built to service these really huge towers? If you know.
So if you go from 12 to 15 or whatever, John, are these vessels able to accommodate those larger towers? And if you go to floating technology, is it a whole different installation tool than the one we've just seen?
Floating is kind of floating. You have it's different. It's quite different. So floating, it's not my specialty, to be honest. But floating, there's different ways to go about it. Some of it can be constructed in port and then towed out. But in terms of your question about the ability to install different types of turbines, different size of turbines, you'll see the ability for any new build, like the one that Dominion and the consortium is proposing, will cover anywhere from the 6 megawatt up to probably 15 megawatt. And then if a vessel like some of the vessels that are global right now, if they don't meet the ability, usually it's crane size, Peter, is the limiting factor, or it could be the jack-up leg size. Those can be modified in shipyard, where you could add some length to the legs, to jack-up ability, and you can modify the cranes. So there are upgrades that can be done through the life of the ships, but certainly anyone that builds a new one is going to be looking at the ability to install for the next 20 years at least the size that we know that will be in the marketplace.
Peter, follow up.
Okay, yes. Did I hear you say that the anchored towers are much cheaper than the others to build, or did I mishear that?
No, I didn't say cheaper.
Less expensive? Nothing's cheap.
No, I don't think they're less expensive. It's different techniques. So
Right.
some of that can be assembled in port and towed out. It depends on a lot of factors, but floating wind, obviously for where we're looking at and I can only speak for Orsted, in our lease areas is not currently an option.
So Peter, anything else? And then I'm gonna just do a time check. Okay. All right, so we're about at noon. So what we want to kind of stay on task here. Our intent is we really appreciate the presentation by Dana. Thank you so much, John. The videos, the back and forth conversation about applicability. What we'd like to do is take a very short break, probably 5 minutes. And then for folks who are not task force members, we welcome you to go on about your day. For folks who are task force members, if you can stay on, we just want to have a little bit of task force only conversation, just generally about this, further questions, further conversation, and we'll just have that run no later than 12:30 to be aware of everybody's busy days. And we do have 2 interns from Rhoda who'd like to listen into that. If anybody has any concern, and the interns listening into the task force discussion, just sort of chat function me privately, or Lane or Fiona if there's questions. And then before we wrap up, Lane, I think maybe you have one last question that you wanted to raise. So why don't we turn it to you?
Yeah, it might be a little bit longer than a short question, so I can
raise
it.
One more question. I won't say short.
Well, I was just thinking about the New Jersey port plan that is happening, and thinking about I was just more curious about, like, what size barges are we talking about if they're going to be moving parts from onshore to these jackup vessels, and just thinking about the Delaware Bay and the shallowness of it. And I just don't know enough about barges and those big vessels. And I know that's for the Mid-Atlantic, and I'm not sure if in New Bedford or other places in New England, if they're kind of talking about the same thing. And maybe if Dana or John or whomever can speak to what kind of vessels might be used or are planning to be used.
The beauty of the New Jersey port is that there's no bridges, there's no overhead air gap restrictions, there's no draft restrictions, because Delaware Bay has very large shipping channels.
Yeah.
And so, John, the understanding, at least in the New Jersey projects, is that being able to get on US-based vessels, getting the equipment out there isn't going to be an issue because of bridges or draft or depth or dredging or whatever.
Yeah, there's several ports, including New Jersey, Virginia as well, that don't have some of the limitations that some Northeast ports do, like bridges.
And that is a consideration as we talk about whether it's feeder barges versus a Jones Act or U.S. flagged wind installation vessel, is if you can actually accommodate that in different states and ports on the land side based off of the various bridge restrictions, given the tall legs we saw.
Great.
Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, so everybody, we're going to give people a 5-minute break. We'll put ourselves up on mute. At 12:10, we'll start up again with the task force only for some final conversation and the like. And again, I think really appreciate the presentation. Thank you, Dana. And really appreciate the good information and the expertise that you brought to bear. All right, hang tight. Hopefully,
thanks, Dana.
Stay on at 12:10.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dana.
Thank you.